Europe is ready to assume its responsibilities. Rearm Europe could mobilize close to 800 billion euros of defense expenditures for safe and resilient.
Well, I just think you should be more appreciative because this country has stuck with them through thick and thin. We've given them much more than Europe, and you're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards. Right now, you don't.
The European Union's shocking move has pushed the world closer to a dangerous tipping point. For years, the EU has relied on NATO and the United States for protection. But now, things are changing. Billions and billions of dollars are being poured into the EU's defense budget, completely changing the global power dynamics. Maybe the EU is finally stepping out of its training wheels, but the questions lingering on everyone's minds are far more troubling. Will the United States step back from NATO? Can Europe hold its ground against global superpowers? Is the European Union gearing up for a much bigger attack? To get the answer to these questions, you'll have to stay tuned till the end. Think you have got it all figured out? Drop a comment below, hit the like button, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The results of the long 12-hour talks among the 27 leaders of the European Commission were shocking, to say the least. The EU President, Ursula von der Leyen, announced a plan called Rearm Europe, an $863 billion defense boost for the EU. The news came shortly after Trump halted Ukraine's military aid. But how do these two events connect? Let's hit rewind. For decades, the United States has been the backbone of Europe's defense. The alliance between the two eventually gave rise to NATO, an organization which wraps a security blanket over the US and the European countries. An attack on one country means an open call for war from the other countries. Simple, yet powerful. But then Trump took office and started questioning America's role on the global platform. From tariffs to threats, the president has been sending mixed signals from day one. It seems as if he is leading the United States into the battleground, repeatedly testing the loyalty of his allies. First, there were the hefty tariffs on the UK, and then his brazen threats to pull back America's commitment to Europe's security. Is he trying to assert dominance over other superpowers? Maybe. But what Trump didn't expect was for Europe to retaliate so quickly. Only recently, Europe found itself in between crossroads, facing threats from both the East and the West. This led to the EU to come to the horrible realization that they are indeed alone. Despite the panic, the EU made the sound decision of taking Europe's security into their own hands. Enter the era of rearmament. But as rebellious as this looks, the defense budget had more than one motive. The EU wanted to make a clear statement of backing up Ukraine. The Russian-Ukrainian war is dragging into its fourth year, a constant threat on the continent. Europe knows it cannot rely on outside help anymore. The United States once intended to bring peace between the two lands. But Trump's nasty little surprise shocked everyone. He called Volodymyr Oleksandrovich Zelensky to Washington only to berate him in front of the world. Europe wasn't too happy about the unexpected spat. With Putin's gradual invasion into Ukraine on one end and Trump's aggressive stance on the other, Europe knows that it is the only one left to handle the Ukrainian crisis. A retaliation by the EU was inevitable, but nobody expected it to be this fierce. EU's new move will pump up Europe's defense with funds going to air and missile defense, artillery systems, ammunition, drones and air transport, cyber systems, artificial intelligence, and electronic warfare. The stakes are higher than ever. But does Europe even have the money to boost its defense budget? Truth be told, the European Commission doesn't have the money lying around. So, when von der Leyen announced the defense boost, was it just an empty threat? Not quite. Let's break it down. When the EU saw the US backing out, it knew it had to put all of its eggs in one basket. That's how Rearm Europe came into the mix, a long-term plan to secure Europe's future. Step 1 is to ease the EU's spending rules. Here's the deal. NATO requires all of its members to spend at least 2% of their GDP on defense. If you look back, only Poland, Greece, and Estonia have been consistently meeting these guidelines. So it is a rule that many EU members have been taking lightly. Trump noticed it, and has been pressuring the EU to step up. But that decision isn't up to the EU members alone. Think of the countries trying to swim against a strong current. They are trying to meet NATO's guidelines, but there's something holding them back: EU's budget restrictions. You see, EU members are under tight budget rules by the European Commission. Each country cannot exceed 3% of GDP, and its debt should not surpass 60% of GDP. If they do, they will come face to face with the EU's penalties, cutting spending and raising taxes. Before all the drama began, the countries were reluctant to boost the military budget, fearing that they would breach the EU's restrictions and face the consequences. But now, the EU itself is loosening the grip on its members. They have allowed the countries to increase their spending by 1.5% of the GDP without triggering penalties. Imagine a bird breaking free from its cage, finally allowed to sneak back into the wild. If each EU member follows through, they could free up around $696 billion over the next 4 years. In the end, it could help EU meet NATO's 2% defense spending guidelines too. So, is the EU trying to sneak back into the good books of the United States? Maybe. But it isn't where the 5-part plan ends. The second step of the European defense strategy requires a little help from the European Commission. They have set up a separate loan of nearly $160 billion, only for their defense plan. The EU members can borrow from the loan, but only if they meet all the guidelines for the defense budget. The loan is like getting a trophy after you win the race. Only the countries that follow the rules will get their share. But here's the twist that Donald Trump probably never expected. The defense funds are not only for Europe's security. The member states can also use this money to support Ukraine in their war against Russia. It is a pretty smart move by the EU. Many countries didn't have the funds to boost their own defense while helping Ukraine. Now, they can borrow from the EU's defense funds to supply military aid to Ukraine without drowning in the debts of their own. While these two steps offer adequate funding for defense, the EU refuses to stop here. They have created a backup plan that could potentially free up even more money for defense. This is where I introduce you to the EU's cohesion funds. Think of it like a joint account for all the EU members. The richer countries contribute to the account, and the weaker countries can withdraw from it whenever they need it. This allows the EU to progress as a whole, rather than relying on one country to pull all the weight. Now, the EU didn't take the cohesion funds as part of the defense plan, but it has given the members the option to pull out their money if they want to fund their defense investments. As per the sources, the EU dedicated about $420 billion to its cohesion policy for the period of 2021 to 2027, and the cohesion funds fall under that policy. If the countries decide to withdraw their money from the pool, it can help free up a lot of money for the EU's defense. But that's not all. Von der Leyen saved the best for the last. The fourth and fifth step consists of a secret weapon, one that EU hasn't fully revealed yet. EU intends to accelerate the creation of a savings and investment union, and this move is pretty bold. On hindsight, this decision allows private companies to access funds and build weapons on Europe's specific needs. This strategy gives private industry the power to step up and help meet the defense demands, ensuring that Europe has all that it needs to step foot into the battle. But do all the 27 members on the EU even agree to this bold defense plan? European Commission has 27 members, representing both big and small names around Europe. When the Rearm Europe plan was proposed, almost everyone was on board with the plan, except one country, Hungary. Hungary, led by Prime Minister Viktor Orban, is the only European country with a close relationship with Russia. Talk about finding a needle in the haystack. The country has long supported Putin and, surprisingly, aligns with Trump's stance on the Russian-Ukrainian war. Because of this, Hungary has refused to hand out billions of dollars in arms to support Ukraine and has heavily criticized the EU's defense investment plans. So, does that mean the Rearm Europe plan is dead in the water? Not exactly. The EU respects Hungary's stance in the whole dilemma, but let's remember, it is one vote against 26. The EU doesn't run on a veto system. So, Hungary's objection doesn't do much to outweigh the support of the other members of the European Commission. As a result, the EU has decided to push forward without Hungary's support on their new military defense plan. Only a few days ago, Donald Trump decided to put a stop to billions of dollars worth of military aid going to Ukraine from the United States. This came off as a pretty aggressive move and caught many off guard. The aid was already committed to Ukraine, and the United States had been Ukraine's largest contributor to Ukraine in its war against Russia, having sent over $60 billion in aid. The announcement came after the explosive meeting between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Trump at the White House. Trump justified the decision by claiming that Ukraine wasn't ready to pursue peace, which led him to strip away their military support. This was quite shocking for the EU, not just because it came out of the blue, but because the US asked to consult with the European leaders before making such a big decision. Paweł Wroński, Polish Foreign Ministry spokesperson, tried to sugarcoat the whole drama. He told the media that it has great political significance, especially since it was made without consultation by the NATO or the Ramstein Group. The latter is an organization of 57 countries that has been sending funds to support Ukraine since Russia's invasion in 2022. Meanwhile, the French president, Emmanuel Macron, who has long argued for Europe to become more independent in its defense strategies, saw this as a major turning point. The Rearm Europe seemed like a dream come true, a step toward the goal, but it came with political consequences. Macron warned that Europe distancing itself from NATO could be a bold but risky move. Relying heavily on Europe's internal resources without NATO's backing would be a massive step for Europe, one that could have harmful effects on the continent. Whatever the world thinks, the EU has made a decision, and it seems that it isn't planning on backing out. So, the big question remains, is Europe ready to stand alone? The defense plan is already in motion, but the fear among EU members is pretty evident. Although we aren't there yet, the question is lingering as clear as day. What if the US pulls out of NATO? Would that leave Europe all alone while defending its barriers from Russia? Let's look at NATO. The United States has been the backbone of the organization for decades, offering support to various countries around the globe. The country has always provided a lion's share of military support and defense funding. But the unfairness behind the whole situation probably didn't sit well with the current president of America, Donald Trump. Time and time again, Trump warned that if EU members didn't meet the 2% defense budget guidelines, the US will have no choice but to pull out of NATO. Pay up or you're on your own. It was a clear stance, but a frightening threat. Whether or not Trump was serious is a big debate, but it definitely made all the EU members incredibly anxious. Trump has always been quite bold with his decisions, quite similar to what we saw happen between him and the Ukrainian president a few days ago. All of this has forced the EU to think of a future where they might have to defend themselves without America's support. And that's a terrifying thought, especially with Russia's aggressiveness on a clear display in Ukraine. With the US out of the picture, there is no stopping Putin from making one bold move. Today, it is Ukraine. Tomorrow, it could be another state in Europe. Who is to say that Putin would stop after taking over Ukraine? Take a look at the geography. Ukraine shares its borders with countries like Belarus, Hungary, Moldova, Poland, Romania, and Slovakia. Some of these countries, like Hungary, have openly shown their support for Russia. Could it become Russia's secret ally and decide to turn its back on the EU? With EU's defenses stretched thin and a Russian victory in Ukraine, there is no doubt that it would open the door into Central Europe, a threat that's looming on the heads of the EU members every passing day. But what if Russia decides that Ukraine is not the big prize? Once they have Ukraine, they might form alliances with other smaller nations, or worse, conquer them too. Ultimately, they could gain access to the heart of Europe, intimidating the defenses of the big countries. All in all, Europe could be facing an existential threat. To counter this fear, it is no surprise that the EU decided to bring in this massive budget for its defense. If you didn't already know, the US defense budget summed up to $841.4 billion in the year 2024. It appears that with the Rearm Europe's plan, the EU is scrambling to fill the void left by America's aid. But here's the problem. It isn't an overnight fix. Although the Rearm plan does strengthen Europe, it is a long haul. Even after 4 years, they will only have a fraction of what the US was contributing. So, no, it does not mean that the EU will cut ties with the US or the NATO, but they are walking a tightrope, balancing their defense like a ballerina on stage. One wrong move, and they can fall pretty hard in front of the whole crowd. It could tear them away from their biggest ally and open the doors to a global conflict that no one is prepared to handle. On the flip side, if they play their cards right, they could finally build a defense strong enough to stand on their own. It all comes down to Trump. If he decides to push forward against the EU, the impact won't just be political. It could hit you, your family, and your connection to the world beyond the United States border. Do you think Trump will pull off this big move? If you enjoyed this video, press the bell icon and you'll be the first to know of our next upload. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to share your thoughts in the comment section below.